the Geass and the Death Note. These have undeniably become one of the most popular abilities in all of anime, not only because of their interesting effects, but also because of the way the protagonist uses this ability in interesting ways to create mind games against the adversity they have to face, as well as both of them belonging to the two most popular protagonists of the 2000s, who went on to shape the anime fandom as cornerstones in the future, Light and Lelouch. Light and Lelouch have been compared an endless amount of times at this point, so how about rather than comparing those two, we instead compare Zero and Kira's ability against the other? Which of these abilities are better than the other when we actually compare these two in various situations, as well as criteria to answer the question, Geass or Death Note, what's better? We will only be using Lelouch's Geass to make this an interesting discussion or debate at all, since without it, the comparison will be highly skewed in Geass's favor because of the dozens or more Geass as well as users of it that exist, which wouldn't create a fair conversation against just a single Death Note. Considering we're already talking about Kira from Death Note, it'd be a bit unfair to not include the other Kira that I've discussed on this channel before, and it's from today's sponsor, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Golden Spirit. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Golden Spirit is a mobile-friendly, cross-generation RPG, where you and your friends can assemble your own teams from the iconic characters from parts 1 to 6 to create the true dream team and to get a chance to experience the epic and cinematic stand battles, a game you can't miss at any cost if you're a true JoJo fan. Pre-registration is already up for both iOS as well as Android users globally. If you pre-register now, then you'd also get access to special milestone rewards as more and more people pre-register for the game to make for an even better experience when the game fully launches. With the final reward for the pre-registration milestone being our SR Joseph Joestar, arguably one of the smartest characters in the series. As a hardcore JoJo's fan for the better part of a decade, I can't help but say this game is shaping up to be great with the faithful adaptation of the characters, stands, and abilities for one of my favorite stories, with there being plenty of surprise secondary characters you might not expect to appear in the beginning. The animations of stands, the art of the characters, all of it is on a completely different level, with peak JoJo's energy to go alongside it. Pre-register with the first link in the description box below. We will be comparing the two in these situations. First is how Kira/Zero actually use them in their respective stories, since it's important to compare how the actual series used them and decide who was a better user of the ability itself. Second, we'll compare them in real-life applicability and what you, the viewer, will most benefit from having it if you were given the choice between the Death Note and Geass, as well as a general benefit from it. And finally, which of these is more dangerous, as well as which one is more usable, presuming that someone does want to carry out the use of their abilities in the same way. While this isn't a video discussing who's necessarily smarter between Light and Zero, we will still be analyzing the way they use their respective abilities and who was smarter in using them to their maximum potential. An interesting point that we can begin this conversation with is how Zero is not actually as reliant on the Geass as Light is on the Death Note as you'd think. Considering the amount of episodes in the series, you'd expect him to have abused it far more often, but that isn't the case, as most of the time, the Geass acted as a supplement to help his strategic decision in the midst of battles, as well as act as a secret weapon to disrupt his enemy. Most importantly, Lelouch's intelligence being the most important factor rather than his Geass. Lelouch has also said in R1 that even if C2 hadn't ever formed a contract with him, it wouldn't have changed much at all, considering he had planned to overthrow Britannia in the future anyway, and it was just the Geass gave him the ability to fast forward it by many years. But even then, it wasn't like Lelouch would haven't been able to execute his plan in the future without it, even if it did make the path easier on paper. However, we can't really say the same for Light at all, considering we know that at best he'd become a detective in the future, becoming a part of the system of corruption and being unable to do anything about it, or being able to change it in any meaningful way at all if he hadn't ever got his hands at the Death Note at all. Lelouch also did quickly figure out the rules of the Geass, since he needed to actually educate himself on what the limits of it were, as he had to gather the information for himself rather than getting it written for him as well. Not to mention him moving beyond his original use of just using it to kill someone, but also using it to manipulate their actions in his strategies, as well as getting battle information, attack enemy formation, as well as creating disorder and a lot more to creatively use the Geass's powers. Before anyone comments about the Euphemia incident, I disagree with thinking it's the best case to use in this conversation regarding their use of the Geass, since Lelouch genuinely did not intend for that to be a real order he wanted to give to her, even if it was a terrible joke in retrospect. Lelouch did oversee the fact that his Geass might also become more uncontrollable at times from the hint from Mao, but even then, I don't think it says much about Zero's use of the Geass. But even if you accounted for this, I genuinely don't see how you could argue that Zero is a not better user of his ability than Light, considering the Lind L. Taylor trap and the absolute fumble that it was in hindsight. Before that incident, Light could have been quite literally anywhere on the planet. And even L said it himself, that he didn't think this plan had a high rate of success before it worked, but Light still decided to kill Lind L. Taylor, which brought the possible candidates to being in the several billions to the specific population of the Kanto region of Japan within a singular mistake, despite the fact he was using a supernatural, completely untraceable weapon that no one else beside him was aware of at the moment, completely erasing the scope of candidates by dozens of times. The very premise of Kira and Light's god complex, pride and ego, extremely limits how the Death Note itself can be used because of the flaws it creates in the methodology behind his killings, as it is what makes a killer case solvable in the first place to begin with, despite the Death Note being a completely supernatural and untraceable weapon. Light did want to be known, so in context, it does make sense why he allowed the world to know about him, but it's nonetheless a flaw in how the Death Note could be optimally used by someone else who didn't commit the same mistakes he did, as well as just refuse to engage in a mind game with L, with there being a lot of things he could have done differently, with his limitations to the cause of deaths mostly being heart attacks being the primary cause, when there could have been a lot of different ways that the Death Note could have been used to make it fundamentally impossible to ever even do anything about it. His ego tends to get in the way a lot of times. We see this manifest in a common pattern in the series, where multiple times, Light goes out of his way to get the final laugh on his opponent that are trying to stop him, whether that be Rei, Naomi, L, or even Nier, to get that arrogant sense of victory that he was smarter than them, and that they weren't capable of catching Kira, which gives us just more evidence on how he might put his anonymity in danger just so he can show his ego more. It's extremely hard to pinpoint any Lelouch's mistakes and decisions that were as brutal as Light's. Even Euphemia's massacre was not as bad as this one fumble Light made by succumbing to his ego, considering that Light would have likely been fine for the rest of the series if he just didn't fail to this one trap. But it would be a bit deceptive to imply that Light is totally incompetent with using the Death Note, since considering the limitations he put on himself, he's fairly good with using it in spite of that. Considering the fact that he did think of ideas such as using smaller pieces of the Death Note pages to use whenever he's not at his house, or whenever the Death Note is currently stored so that he could kill anyone he wants with just a pen to write the names of the person, as well as his memory loss plan, which did creatively use the rules of possession and ownership of the Death Note to get him out of the checkmate L had him in, and then the creation of the 13-day rule, which ultimately led to his victory against L. Even then, I can't see how you could value that over the general potential missing in the approach Kira takes, by undervaluing the true potential of the Death Note as a weapon capable of mass murder that could have been used in the better hands on someone else who held the same idea of justice, as well as lacked a god complex so that they could have done his job in a better and more effective way. It's not like Lelouch doesn't also have some moral constraints, at least on what he'll use a Geass to do, but even then, those are only mostly restricted to the people very close to him, as well as his idealism regarding creating a better world for everyone else, which would be harder if he did truly abuse the Geass to its truest potential, but they're still nowhere near as restricting as Light's own constraint on how that affects his use of the Death Note. So in the end, I think that considering the fact that not only does Light make the far worse mistake between the both of them by killing Lind L. Taylor, but also is far less than the perfect user of the Death Note who would have been willing to actually use a weapon to its fullest of potential in how the deaths themselves are carried out, which would have made it nigh impossible to prove Kira's existence to begin with. And the fact that Zero in general is far better at using the Geass consistently, and is also nowhere near as reliant upon it as Light to carry out his objective, with his character aligning perfectly with his Geass as well. With the final point I would like to add in this conversation being how, despite the fact that Lelouch's rebellion took place in a far shorter time span than Light's rebellion against the state of the current world, Kira still failed, whereas Zero did not. Crime rates eventually rose back up after Kira was dead. Even if he managed to create an era of fear with lesser crimes, lesser wars, he still failed at creating a better world, as it went back to how it was before he was there the moment he died. The Zero Requiem is also not something eternal. Eventually, people will be at odds with each other again, because that is just our human nature and we will always be like that. But even then, Zero did manage to change the course of the world for the better. Even if both of them died, they still left behind far different worlds, where Zero continued living on, even if Lelouch himself was no longer there to witness the world he has created anew. And in that sense, Lelouch is truly the better user. Now, when it comes to the average person who has genuinely no motive to either become Kira or either Zero and what they can do with their respective abilities, the Death Note is pretty versatile in what it can do, but that is only strictly with everything related to causing death beforehand. Meaning that if you want to use any of the other things you could do with this, such as control another person, you'd also have to make them die soon afterwards after writing whatever they can do in a Death Note. Geass, on the other hand, as we've seen in the story multiple times over, is far more versatile. Not only can you basically do the same thing by ordering the person to die, you can even go as far as to even tell the person how exactly they should die, similar to the Death Note, and much more. Geass gives you absolute control over what the person it's used on can do, so not only can it cause death in the same way the Death Note can, but also can allow you to control the actions of a person without even allowing them to die. So you can do things like having someone like Schneizel who was forced to obey absolutely to Zero until the day he dies because of the Geass. Or even just do smaller things like getting a coffee every day for free by using it on a certain person at a certain time, as well as generally do everything and more of what the Death Note can do with its ability to control people without making the person die, and giving you better control, considering you could give a command like, "Obey everything I say," and there you have it. You can use this to make sure you get great grades at school even if you don't study at all, by using it on the teacher. You can get any job you want by once again using the Geass, and genuinely having everything in your life go the best it can by controlling all the factors that could affect it. For most people in general, the Geass gives them far better results since most of us aren't interested in becoming active users of the Death Note, or well, at least not enough to give up the chance to get a Geass in exchange for it. Hence, I consider Geass the more versatile tool. Next up is their danger/usability. The Death Note is pretty easy to learn how to use it. The only possible limitation you could say is that the rules are written in English, and that most people likely wouldn't believe it on first sight, which could lead them to just throwing it away. But I do think most people would have at least slight curiosity to write someone's name. There is also the problem of having to carry the Death Note, but similar to Light, it's easier to carry pages of smaller bits of the notebook on your body that would make for easy use, even if you're not at home or in a tight situation, hiding it inside your watch or anywhere at all, since nobody would suspect anything a random piece of paper. Lelouch's Geass, on the other hand, has a problem that it eventually goes out of its control, as we see in R1 with enough uses of it. So it will become harder to control when you want to say things using a Geass. And we know how the first misuse of the Geass ended up causing a big problem in the story. There's also the factor of Geass itself having limitations/rules that you have to learn by yourself, rather than being spoon-fed to you like the Death Note, meaning that you have to go out of your way to think about all of those tests and then find people to run those tests on like Lelouch, which makes it far less convenient to say. Without even accounting for how there's a set distance from which it could be active, the requirement for the person the Geass is used on to actually audibly hear the order when being given makes it far less convenient than a Death Note just requiring a name and a face. The only benefit is that Geass can always be activated whenever the person wants and doesn't require you to write something down, which would be longer than saying it out loud. But still, the other factors like not being able to control yourself as well as the rules of the Geass being something you need to figure out make it overall less convenient. When we talk about how dangerous these powers are, I mean it in the sense of how dangerous would the average person be if we just gave them these abilities, and presume that they will take on the same mantle of killing criminals and Lelouch's desire to reconstruct the world anew. It would have to be the Death Note by far. The average Death Note user will most likely be far less cautious per se when they use a Death Note, but they'd have far better sense of what to do to not attract attention, which was the entirely opposite goal of what Light wanted to do, since it wanted to be known as a god of the new world. Without any particular patterns to follow, or even the existence of Akira being certain, the average Death Note user could get away with far more, without even the suspicion of a Akira case beyond just being a conspiracy that was believed in by a few people, and the likelihood that the user most likely would not hold a god complex that became Light's biggest problem in the series. The Geass, on the other hand, genuinely requires the user to be a lot more intelligent with how they use the Geass, since not only does it have a limit on how many times it can be used, but also requires direct contact with the person itself to be able to use the power on its own. Not to mention, Lelouch's goal requires far more intelligence than what just being kid up without having to deal with L's mind game 24/7 is. Not to mention, you have to be the one who finds out about all the rules, limitations, and then even the problems that can arise due to using the Geass too much. As well as the traceability back to you as a suspect is far more likely to happen compared to the Death Note user who does not have a god complex. In my opinion, while the Death Note itself is a far better weapon than the Geass, it is still far less versatile on what it can do, considering it will always ensure that the person dies afterwards. Whereas the Geass can command the user to do anything once, meaning that there's far more use cases for it overall, since murder is only part of what it can be used for, and definitely not the limit. But that's just my opinion. If you disagree with it, then feel free to comment why you think so in the comments, and present what you would do if you got either the Geass or the Death Note, or even join the Discord server if you want a better chance to be able to discuss things with me.